with air pollution. They're the ninth state, highest state with the most work-related deaths. They're the eighth highest state with premature deaths, which is the central litmus test for a civilization, for a society civilization level. Kentucky is the number 8th state in terms of the most cardiovascular deaths. Kentucky is the 6th fattest state. Kentucky is number 1 for animal abuse. Kentucky is the 3rd state with the highest amount of children in poverty, 25%. So 1 out of 4 of Kentucky kids are poor. We're the 2nd highest state with the most preventable hospitalizations. 37% of our kids are fat, 31% of our adults are fat. And the adult rate has increased 10% in 1990, from 1990 till recently, which is alarming since Kentucky's number of obese people has tripled in just 2 decades. Kentucky is 44th in wealth, so we're poor. Kentucky is 41st in overall health, so we're sick. 40% of us don't even know how to read. And Kentucky is 47th in education, so we're dumb. 2 out of 5 of us cannot read. We Kentuckians in general, compared to other states, are poor, sick, and dumb. Kentucky is the 3rd highest state for having the most smokers. Kentucky is the 4th highest state with binge drinking, which is pretty remarkable since 70 of Kentucky's 120 counties are dry. But the official data says that prohibition has never ended in Kentucky. That's why we still got moonshiners, and that's why Appalachia is producing 70% of America's pot. And Kentucky's number 1 cash crop is marijuana. It's in our history. It's in our blood. It's our tradition. Kentucky was raised on hemp. Hemp's been a key crop for Kentucky since forever, since the beginning till today. Today, they're producing a ton of pot in Appalachia. You want to find the good stuff? Go to Appalachia. Go to Pike County. Go to Inez. Appalachia still looks the same as it did when Robert Kennedy visited 40 years ago. 60% of Letcher County doesn't even have running water. 60%. So that's 3 out of 5 people in Letcher County don't even have running water. I mean, that's the standards of a third world country. They're having to get their water out of a creek or having to go to a cistern and get a tank filled and carrying it home. For the last 40 years, we only had 1 Republican governor of Kentucky, and that's Ernie Lee Fletcher. And he only served for 1 term. So the perennial poverty, the perennial poor health, the perennial low education, the perennial poor workers' rights and working conditions, the perennial insanity, the perennial newly constructed prisons, the perennial children dying prematurely and in abuse cases, which is institutionalizing a failed state. So, Kentucky is a failed civilization because we can't protect our most precious. We can't protect our babies. So the perennial obesity and the tooth decay institutions, all these are institutions of Kentucky that have been perennial, and they've been institutionalized because of Kentucky's Democrats. Even historians don't give Gatewood Galbraith enough credit. Harrison and Clotter's New History of Kentucky failed to even mention Gatewood's name in the 1991 election. He did wonder, though, if the future of Kentucky politics will be as colorful as the Stanley Morrow race. And if we'll ever get colorful oratory, such as what Henry Clay could do, and John C. Breckinridge, and Billy O.B. Bradley, and Al Ben Barkley, or Happy Chandler, the Happy Manhandler, without any hint of irony whatsoever. So, Clotter, sorry, buddy, you had your Huey Long. You had Kentucky's Robert Penn Warren's Willie Starks in front of your eyes, and you couldn't even see them. And I think you're still writing stuff today. So you definitely forgot Gatewood Galbraith in the history of Kentucky, and he's been the most real person in Kentucky politics in clearly in the last 20 years. He might have done some political stuff before 1991 governor's race. I'm sure he did. Probably 30 years. He's probably doing 30 years. So most of the governors that I've mentioned in this short bit have been forgotten, and they're not known by most of Kentucky's people. But Gatewood is known. He was live. He was real. He was authentic. He was genuine, and he was kind. But it seems as though if a person wants to win an election, then they should just talk like a boring bureaucratic politician, go as slow and be as boring and dull as Ben Stein, Bueller, Mueller. So that way nobody pays any attention to what you're saying. Rand Paul, who Kentucky elected senator in November 2010, a little over a year ago, is Ron Paul's mini-me. Ideologically, he is identical to Ron Paul. Ron Paul is Rand Paul's hero, Senator Rand Paul. So that means Kentucky voted for a radical, the radical right, the Tea Party. I think Rand Paul is actually a bigger Tea Party darling than Sarah Palin.
I'm Jack Conway. I approve this message.
Why was Rand Paul a member of a secret society that called the Holy Bible a hoax that was banned for mocking Christianity and Christ? Why did Rand Paul once tie a woman up, tell her to bow down before a false idol, and say his god was Aqua Buddha? Why does Rand Paul now want to end all federal faith-based initiatives and even end the deduction for religious charities? Why are there so many questions about Rand Paul?
Welcome back. We have a shocking development tonight. I actually agree with Rand Paul. The Republican senatorial candidate seemed to hint at his support for legalizing drugs in an interview with a local news station in Kentucky.
I personally think we've been trying the federal solution, and there may be some good aspects to it, but it's also, we're still failing. We're not getting rid of the drug problem.
Well, that seems pretty clear. In the immortal words of Cypress Hill, he seems to be saying, legalize it. It's my best Cypress Hill. And that's the principal libertarian position, don't get me wrong. Get the government out of our lives, and he has a compelling case that the federal government has screwed this one up entirely. It's not like we're winning the war on drugs. We were so close to completely agreeing until he came up with this bizarre explanation of what we should do instead about the drug problem.
You want rich people because they create jobs. If you punish rich people, they won't expand and create jobs.
Give money to rich people? What does that have to do with drugs? Unless Rand Paul's on some. But that's also the problem with libertarian ideology. It usually devolves into let the rich get richer and everything will magically fix itself. But his comments do lead to a discussion of the larger issue at hand. Should we legalize it? Joining me now to talk about that issue is former New Mexico Governor Gary Johnson.
You want rich people because they create jobs. If you punish rich people, they won't expand and create jobs.
Rand Paul just doesn't get it. He doesn't get Kentucky. He doesn't get or understand this issue.
Conway says drugs are a major problem in eastern Kentucky and believes the government needs to work more with local law enforcement to help.
I believe so passionately that we have to do more, and we have to do more in a bipartisan way. I mean, that's the reason that I've reached out to Operation Unite, and Congressman Rogers and I have been able to work together on this issue.
Both agree Kentucky needs to work on this drug epidemic, but they have different approaches. Marcus Conroy, WYMT Mountain News.
Conway, under the provisions, would it be possible that an American citizen then could be declared an enemy combatant and sent to Guantanamo Bay and detained indefinitely?
I think that as long as that individual, no matter who they are, if they pose a threat to the security of the United States of America, should not be allowed to continue that threat.
Know good and well that someday there could be a government in power that is shipping its citizens off for disagreements. There are laws on the books now that characterize who might be a terrorist. Someone missing fingers on their hands is a suspect, according to the Department of Justice. Someone who has guns, someone who has ammunition that is weatherproofed, someone who has more than 7 days of food in their house can be considered a potential terrorist. If you are suspected by these activities, do you want to have the government have the ability to send you to Guantanamo Bay for indefinite detention? A suspect. We're not talking about someone who has been tried and found guilty. We're talking about someone suspected of activities. But some of the things that make you suspicious of terrorism are having food, having more than 7 days of food, missing fingers on your hand, having ammunition, having weatherproofed ammunition, having several guns at your house. Is that enough? Are you willing to sacrifice your freedom for liberty? I would argue that we should strike these detainee provisions from this bill because we are giving up our liberty. We are giving up the constitutional right to have due process before we're sent to a prison. This is very important. I think this is a constitutional liberty we should not look at and blithely sign away to the executive power or to the military. So I would call for support of the amendment that will strike the provisions on keeping detainees indefinitely, particularly the fact that we could now for the first time send American citizens to prisons abroad. I think that is a grave danger to our constitutional liberty, and I advise a vote to strike these provisions from the bill.
Rand Paul is against all of America's wars for empire. So he's a Republican and he's against all the wars. He wants to bring all the troops home, including Afghanistan and Somalia and Germany and Japan, all the 120 military bases. He wants to come back. America, all the military bases that America's got all over the world. Rand Paul is also for the legalization of marijuana, heroin, Oxycontin, and crack cocaine. Rand Paul is against the expansion of police powers in the Patriot Act, and he's against the invasion of civil liberties by President Barack Hussein Obama's recent NDAA law, which is a law where Americans can be detained indefinitely without any charges being brought up, without a trial, without any due process, if they're suspected of being a terrorist, which means that Barack Hussein Obama is not going to curb the excess powers of the presidency. He is, in fact, going to use all those powers of the presidency. So that's a reversal of the Hope and Change Obama candidate. That was pretty inspiring, that I liked. And then also those being suspected of a terrorist can be anybody, somebody who questions the government, somebody who has 7 days worth of food in their house, or have too many fingers on their hand. But Rand Paul talked very little about those issues which delve into his moral core. In fact, Kentucky elected this bullshitter because when he was talking about balancing the budget or how evil the Federal Reserve was, or Ben Bernanke, all that was boring stuff. It didn't go to his moral core. He would bullshit at Kentucky, okay? Rand Paul bullshit at Kentucky.
In the very short history of this show, it was the moment when Rand Paul announced his candidacy for the United States Senate right here on this show just about a year ago. Dr. Paul, I understand that you yourself have some political ambitions. I was hoping you might talk about those tonight on this show.
Yeah, I do. I'm happy tonight to announce on the Rachel Maddow Show that I'm forming an exploratory committee to run for the U.S. Senate.
Well, yesterday, Rand Paul walloped his Republican primary opponent for that Senate seat, Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson. Mr. Grayson was endorsed by establishment figures like the state's other senator, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, by Dick Cheney, by Rudy Giuliani, by the Chamber of Commerce. But Rand Paul won that race, and he won it handily.
I have a message from the Tea Party. A message that is loud and clear and does not mince words. We've come to take our government back.
The Obama administration could just continue war in Libya at the 60-day mark, which is required by the War Powers Act for the president to go to Congress, and Congress pretty much gave it a free pass. I mean, they passed a resolution last week, but before that, at the 60 days, it really was a non-issue.
Absolutely, and they ignored the declaration of war requirement in the Constitution. What they really need to be doing is start talking impeachment. It's the only way they can get the president to obey the law. If he thinks he's going to be removed from office, if there's a threat of that, bring him over to Congress. Let him justify it in an impeachment proceeding. I got a feeling then presidents might be more cautious about obeying the law.
We're struggling within the Republican Party to define the Republican Party. And I think the Republican Party should be, as our platform says, a party that doesn't believe in bailing out failed businesses, much less owning failed businesses. As our platform says, a party that doesn't believe in bailing out failed businesses, much less owning failed businesses.
It's been one of the major developments in American history in the course of your lifetime. I mean, do you think the 64 Civil Rights Act, or the ADA for that matter, were just overreaches, and that business shouldn't be bothered by people with the basis in law to sue them for redress?
Right. I think a lot of things could be handled locally. For example, I think that we should try to do everything we can to allow for people with disabilities and handicaps. We do it in our office with wheelchair ramps and things like that. I think if you have a two-story office and you hire someone who's handicapped, it might be reasonable to let them have an office on the first floor rather than the government saying you have to have a $100,000 elevator.
Now, you're actually a proponent of the United States not funding, not joining organizations like the IMF, like the World Bank, like the United Nations.